If you want to learn how to turn your World War III level conflict with significant others into something more like a pillow fight, and by pillow fight I don't mean the kind where you stuff bricks into the pillowcase, then this video is for you. I'll show you how to resolve conflict with friends, family members, and significant others effectively and permanently, and who knows, maybe even increase your lifespan by several decades. I'm Dr. Alistair Taylor, a licensed clinical psychologist, and I do a lot of couples and family therapy. Being in a conflict rut with someone can be both infuriating and discouraging, and is a common cause of relationship failure, as well as a contributing factor to mood disorders like depression, and behavioral disorders like chronic drinking, and maybe even some random things like slashed car tires. However, these tips will help you eliminate relationship conflict from your life. So you may not like the first one, but the first thing I should like to get out of the way, and perhaps the most common issue I see in conflict, is that of emotional and behavioral accountability. This means that you take ownership of your feelings and how you express them. Saying things like, "You just make me so angry," implies that the other person is the sole cause of what you are feeling, the degree to which you're feeling it, and the driver of how you express those feelings. This is not a black and white concept, but it requires some critical thinking to understand the nuances. Of course, it is possible that someone can say something to anger you, but the extent to which you are angry rather than patient, compassionate, or understanding of that person is ultimately up to you. And even more so, how you act out your emotions is your responsibility. Think about how we do this sometimes. Which is easier to say? "You're just so annoying," or "I'm just so impatient." One is an accusation that applies blame, relinquishes accountability, and more than likely upsets or pushes the other person away, resolving very little. The other requires humility and vulnerability that invites a similar response from the other person. I also want to be clear here that this does not preclude having anger, for example, but learning to express it effectively and without blame will help to reduce the inflammatory nature of most arguments. Even in the case of one of life's most painful experiences, stepping barefoot on Lego after you've told your child 1,000 times not to leave Lego pieces lying around, it still requires personal accountability for how you react to that, and whether you lose it with your child or use a milder but more effective form of correction. And I'm sure I'm stating the obvious here, but the obvious is not always in awareness when emotion is high. Many times, unloading your anger at someone is not so much because of something they said or did, but rather a reflection of how much pent-up frustration you are carrying around from numerous other experiences, either from that day or even over a lifetime. As the saying goes about the last straw breaking the camel's back, this is one of the reasons why some people gain a lot from therapy when working out issues from their past that haunt them in their present. So suppose you become excessively angry over relatively small issues. In that case, the issue at hand is likely not the issue as it appears on the surface, but rather a long-standing pattern of feeling you're not being heard or feeling consistently dismissed in relationships. It could also be that you simply have more stress on your plate than you can handle. Either way, the better approach than blowing up at someone else under these circumstances is to work out the issues in something like therapy or engage in better self-care, which may also include appropriate relationship boundaries and assertiveness. It still fundamentally puts the locus of control or responsibility of how to act in your hands. The next tip is a related one, and that is using validation. I want to clarify that this is not the same as agreeing with someone. Some folks misconstrue validating another's emotion as having to agree with them or as justification for their behaviors when they are clearly inappropriate. Validation communicates that you understand that the other person is distressed, and you can understand why they may feel the way they do. It does not attempt to evaluate the degree of the distress by saying things like, "You're just overreacting." This is not the same as justifying someone's actions in their heated emotions if they throw a vase at your head. You are validating the person's emotional experience, but not necessarily how they express it. Furthermore, we're still responsible for our emotions and behaviors. You're just trying to empathize with how others are feeling, even when you disagree with them. A simple example is if someone cuts you off badly in traffic and you're already stressed and late for work, and then you start engaging in road rage behaviors. Your frustration is valid, but the behavior is not, hopefully for obvious reasons. A more nuanced example is imagine your child is preparing for an important assignment that is a pass or fail test, and if they fail, it could mean that they would have to retake the entire class. You notice that your child is spending more time playing, socializing, or entertaining themselves at home, and you worry that they underestimate the task. You remind them repeatedly of the importance of the assignment and try to remind them in being more responsible. At some point, however, you also want to cultivate their sense of independent responsibility and for them to learn natural consequences so you don't smother them. And also teach them that their perceived sense of infinite childhood wisdom is in fact quite finite. The day of the assignment passes and your child comes home very upset and disappointed because they failed, and they will have to retake the class. At this point, you have a couple of options. You could offer a blistering rebuke, reminding them of how many times you told them to stay on top of the task and be responsible and that it's their own fault they failed. If you're harsh enough, you might even use labeling or judgment language like, that was a really dumb thing to do, or you were pretty stupid for doing that, which I really wouldn't recommend. Alternatively, you could validate your child's feelings and turn them into a teachable moment. Validating means you empathize and understand your child is upset because they obviously are. And this is upsetting. It's not kicking someone when they're down. Obviously, this doesn't change the consequences. Those remain. But you can discuss with your child after saying something like, I'm sorry you're so disappointed. I can imagine it feels awful knowing you have to retake the whole class. Now, what do you think you did wrong? And what got in the way of doing it right the first time so we can ensure that this doesn't happen again? Some of you may say this example suggests that the parent abdicated responsibility. Still, depending on the child's age, at some point you have to transition between controlling the child because they lack readiness for the real world and learning by experience how to make their own decisions and deal with the consequences. In this case, the consequences are uncomfortable, but certainly not catastrophic. I think a likely reason a lack of validation is hurtful is because it suggests obviously a lack of empathy, but also maybe a degree of hypocrisy. At some point, which of us have not needed understanding rather than judgment from another person? Even if you think the thing the other person is upset about is petty, it may not be to them, and your judgment of what constitutes petty and severe is quite possibly arbitrary. In other words, they may be crying over something you consider nothing, but in other circumstances you may be hurting and they could think what you're going through is nothing and they are unaffected. In a nutshell, assuming that the other person is genuine in their emotion, trying to understand where they are emotionally actually goes much further in relationship building than putting them down to where you think they belong. And for the next tip, this one requires a lot of nuance too. Walking away can be very effective when used correctly. I must stress though that it really helps to mutually agree on this with your partner before an argument is even on the radar, so that it doesn't become a tangential issue. Walking away is not the same as using passive-aggressive behaviors such as throwing your hands up in the air, sighing loudly, or turning your back on someone. Correctly done at the time of onset of heightened emotions, one or both individuals calmly admit that they are getting agitated and would like a timeout to process their thoughts and feelings. I want to emphasize onset because once emotions are flying, it may be too late, and there is just now additional collateral damage to clean up. Then come back to the discussion later. It could be later the same day or the next day. The point is to calmly excuse yourself from the argument so it is not driven by intense emotion. Again, it does not exclude the value of emotion. It just keeps it within normal limits, where you don't say or do something you will regret later. The most hurtful words are typically uttered in the heat of emotion, not when we are calm. One important point here, however, is that you also have to cultivate good awareness that you are becoming emotionally charged. This might sound simple, but more subtle awareness disintegrates in the heat of emotion, and rational thought is compromised. Suppose you have a habit of being swept away in intense emotions. In that case, you may have to learn and train yourself to notice the early symptoms of emotional arousal, which may include racing, incomplete thoughts, or physiological symptoms such as muscle tension, flushing, or altered breathing that may signal the beginning of getting too upset to have a constructive conversation. So maybe it is best to walk away at that point. The next step is learning how to take another person's perspective more effectively. A good and simple reason for this is that, quite simply, we cannot know what it is to be another person. We are stuck inside of the reality we have lived. The closest thing we have to understanding another person's experience is empathy, which is useful but also limited. One example of how uniquely the human brain may perceive the world is that of synesthesia, a relatively rare condition wherein folks have overlapping sensory experiences. For example, they may literally taste cherry when they see the color red. The interesting thing is that for them, this is their normal, so they would likely grow up assuming everyone else has the same experience until some random conversation comes up about the intersection of taste and color, and the synesthete, the person with synesthesia, suddenly realizes that other people experience the world quite differently than they do. This is something of a metaphor for how people have differing perspectives from each other, and we sometimes feel frustration that the other person just can't seem to see it the way we do. Perspectives are not only sensory, but also based on complex models that incorporate our emotions, beliefs, and expectations, and they are thus quite often unique to us. In a more nuanced example, it is worth noting that brains vary significantly from person to person, as evidenced by neuroimaging, such as in MRIs. Even with imaging, it's hard to translate the real-life implications of these differences perfectly, but one example is seen in the different size of the amygdala and the hippocampi in people with trauma history. Because emotion drives language, behavior, and threat perception and conflict, it is hard to know how much emotion the other person feels and how far back their vulnerabilities to strong emotions go. Usually, the further back into childhood the aversive experiences go, the more deep-rooted they are, and they have likely been factors in shaping the person's expectations about themselves or others or the world in general. Again, while each person is still ultimately responsible for their emotions and reactions, the fact that we cannot accurately know their pain heightens the need for compassion and validation, which are effective antidotes to emotional pain, while still maintaining the dialogue that leads to the desired behavior change or finding compromise. And the next tip follows from the previous two. Watch your verbal and nonverbal language. The nonverbals include things like facial expressions, gesticulating wildly with your arms, standing too close and with an intimidating posture, eye rolling, and tone and volume of voice. These types of factors can completely overshadow whatever words come out of your mouth, especially for someone who has been on the receiving end of aggressive bullying or an angry alcoholic father or ex-spouse. Humans react significantly faster to visual threats because they are immediately processed by the nervous system as a tool to avoid danger. The processing of words and language takes much longer in relative terms, so be mindful of this even when your words seem benign, but they are delivered in a threatening manner. It really isn't just what you say, but how you say it. For example, I can see how much you care about this, and I can see how much you care about this. The last tip I want to share is on the topic of being judgmental, which can manifest in a myriad of ways. These include things like labeling the person, the you statements, such as you're impossible or you're just being stubborn and unreasonable. Labeling what they've said, for example, that's just stupid. Or labeling the person's feelings, you're just mad that blah blah blah. Assuming you know what the other person means or is thinking without clarifying it first, questioning their motives, and evaluating their feelings in either direction, such as you're overreacting or you just don't care, As you can probably tell, most of these types of statements are inflammatory and condescending. They will likely elicit a similar response or defensiveness, and this just becomes an infinite loop. Judging is easy, and anyone can do it. Taking time to understand, putting your own feelings on hold for a minute, and being curious about the other person's experience takes a lot of skill and good character. Instead of the above, try to focus on expressing what you feel and asking for what you need. Suppose you're really good at doing this. In that case, you may be able to discern that what you are primarily feeling in some cases, anger, is actually a response to a deeper emotion such as fear. Fear that you'll never be heard or understood, or that this relationship is going to fail, or that you might never ever be happy in love. Drilling down to the deeper emotions requires more insight, but is critically important because it changes the dialogue, the need, and hopefully the other person's response. Emotions are very active in behaviors that follow. Anger, for example, usually elicits either fighting or fear and fleeing from the other person, neither of which facilitates relationship building. However, a more vulnerable expression of a need, the need to feel empathy and understanding, should elicit an approach and comfort behavior from the other person, assuming that they actually care about the relationship. One more important note here is that even if the other person is being judgmental, you still have the choice and power of how to respond to that. Remember that these undesirable and ineffective communication habits are often learned by experience, and most likely the person communicating badly has been on the receiving end of that before. Their judgment-laden language may also be coming from a place of pain or trauma because they themselves are not well versed in empathy. So although it is hard to respond to that language with kindness, it can do wonders to diffuse conflict and model good communication. This is not to say that you need to be a pushover and enable a tyrant. If it's the case that the other person is constantly cruel, disagreeable, and is never open to dialogue, listening, and compromising, at some point maybe you have to put up appropriate boundaries and have your relationship needs met elsewhere. And finally, the last thing that I think offers a much broader synopsis of these issues, or a 30,000-foot view of the problem, if you will, is considering whether persistent conflict is really just a symptom of a core issue of having fallen out of love or out of relationship. This question is much harder to address with a partner because it requires vulnerability at the deepest level, confronting the feeling that the person you love no longer loves you back, or possibly admitting to your partner that you feel you have fallen out of love with them. And this would be very hurtful to someone you care about a great deal. This is something that is a little hard to substantiate from the research literature because so many variables are at play in relationships, and subconscious influences are a little harder to track in relationships compared with overtly obvious behaviors. As one example I have seen quite often in working with couples, some suspiciousness will arise about the partner's behaviors, such as talking to someone of the opposite sex. This might be a completely innocent behavior, but the other spouse may see it as suspicious, and from that point on, their mind may create a narrative that subconsciously filters out all evidence to the contrary, that their partner is now unfaithful. Once evidence is presented that the spouse is faithful, a cognitive dissonance position can take root, and the mind will make up any and all stories to cling to the unfaithfulness narrative. Now, I'm oversimplifying a lot here for the sake of brevity, but often in these cases, it has nothing to do with the partner's behaviors that are viewed as suspicious, and everything to do with a partner who is consumed with doubt. Very often, there is a breadcrumb trail that leads back to some point in their past where they felt deeply unloved or rejected, and that has eventually sprouted into a deep subconscious belief that they are unlovable at the core. This is why sometimes no amount of reassurance that they are loved is sufficient to convert them. They have to deal with the original relationship injury and change that belief system. How this manifests in petty conflict, however, is that, at least from what I observed in clinical experience, it is easier to nitpick and attack the other person because it keeps the focus on them rather than dealing with their core insecurities, and may be viewed as a kind of self-sabotage. In other words, the mind creates the belief that the other person is unfaithful, which gives an excuse to blame the other person, create a rupture in the relationship, and leave it before the possibility that the other person will leave or reject you. These are harsh options, but rejecting another person and ending the relationship might be easier than being rejected, which would confirm your deepest fear that no one will ever really truly love you. Now, of course, there are situations where the suspicion of the partner's behavior is warranted, because obviously infidelities do happen in relationships. I'm just giving an example of how these more subconscious processes can play into chronic relationship conflict. And the conflict is really just a symptom of a missing sense of emotional connectedness and safety that is so vital to all attachments in life. So that's a pretty brief summary of some strategies you can use to resolve conflict. This topic could be a much longer video, but I think the essentials are here, and they don't need to be overcomplicated by lengthy concepts. If you have questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll do my best to respond. All right, thanks for watching.